My second talk will be on faith, reason, and science, and whether there's a harmony or a conflict between them. Then I'll try to present a unified view of reality. So let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom. Pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect. Dissipate that darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So here's the overview. First, I'll try to talk about truth and say what truth is. Then I'll talk about the possibility of doing philosophy. When is philosophy possible, or specifically classical philosophy, and how it relates to these concepts of skepticism, nominalism, materialism, and relativism. Then I'll talk about an umbrella term called Platonism and the recovery of philosophy. Then I'll go to the existence of God and look at what we can prove using reason alone, and then why we need divine revelation and the church. I'll look at the so-called philosophy, the philosophy called scientism and what it entails. And then I'll look at the connection between science, reason, and theism. And then I'll finally look at famous atheists and what atheism sometimes implies as a philosophy. Okay, so what is truth? If we look at the ancients, truth designates the conformity between object and intellect. So if we are able to capture through our intellect what is really there, that means that we have the truth, right? So there's a conformity. That's what Averroes said. And philosophy is a way of getting to the truth based on human reason alone. And is especially relevant when we're interested in answering fundamental questions such as, who am I? Why do I exist? What is there after this life, if anything? And Socrates famously said that, let us follow the truth whithersoever it leads. And St. John Paul II said that we actually may define a human being as the one who seeks the truth. So it's really deep within us. We want to know the truth. We want to understand. And that's exactly what Aristotle said. All men by nature desire to know. We cannot rest until we know, we understand. However, now a question arises. If there is truth, or if it's just something relative. Because Justice Kennedy famously said in Planned Parenthood versus Casey that at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. So what he's trying to say here is that we each define our own truth, but there is no objective truth, right? So it's not about our intellects conforming to what's real. It's about building or just coming up with our own truth. So then it's relative because every person comes up with their own version of truth. So now this classical philosophy of Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonists in general, like Plotinus, and the scholastics, like St. Thomas Aquinas, has been rejected, and instead, since the Enlightenment, we had the rise of various anti-classical philosophical systems. So some might argue that this has led to the downfall of reason. For example, Alex Rosenberg, who's an atheist philosopher at Duke, says the following: I think naturalism is right. So naturalism or atheism or materialism, same thing. But I also think that science forces us a very disillusioned take on reality. It forces us to say no in response to many questions to which most everyone hopes the answers are yes. These are the questions about purpose in nature, the meaning of life, the grounds of morality, the significance of consciousness, the character of thought, the freedom of the will, the limits of human self-understanding, and the trajectory of human history. So Rosenberg thinks that science is true and tells us all kinds of very counterintuitive things about the nature of reality, right? It says that there is no meaning to life, there is no purpose in nature, there is no morality, there is no consciousness, we're not really thinking, there is no freedom of the will, we're predetermined, and so on. Now, if we don't agree with Rosenberg, we might wonder what discipline allows us to kind of put all of human knowledge, all of human knowledge without revelation together. What's the area of philosophy which allows us to synthesize knowledge? And that's metaphysics. So metaphysics is the branch of philosophy which analyzes the most fundamental parts of reality. For example, being, existence, substance, causation, and so on. You see in that picture how, in a way, by doing metaphysics, you can go beyond just the physical. You can really look into the nature of reality itself. But the question arises, whether metaphysics is possible at all. Maybe it's just an illusion that we think we can do metaphysics. And many modern philosophers say that it's not possible to do metaphysics. So starting with Kant, they argue that metaphysics is not possible. And this is because, following Kant, all we know is just a construct of our minds and not reality itself. So human reality under this paradigm is not real reality. So we cannot really get in touch with reality. We can never conform our intellects to the real, because we're always seeing just something else that our minds tell us. So this leads to a type of skepticism, where you don't know what's true and what's not, and also to pluralism, where there can be many valid worldviews. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge in philosophy. And again, many modern philosophers have a view where the mind is completely disconnected from reality and just gets fed representations of reality through the senses. And that's why you hear nowadays more and more often that we live in a simulation, that we don't know if we exist or other people exist. You have all these skeptical scenarios. Are we brains in a vat? And so because of this theory of knowledge, you have to come up with things which are very counterintuitive in a way. So that this leads to skepticism, as I said. And what the skeptic does in general is that he denies that reality can be known by the human mind or by a human being. There are many examples of skepticism. I mean, it started with the ancient Greeks, with Sextus Empiricus. He was the initial skeptic, if you want. But so various scenarios. One, for example, is we do not know if the world exists, right? Maybe only I exist, and you are just creations in my mind. This is called solipsism. Or we do not know if other minds and people exist. Or we do not know if what we see corresponds to reality. There was that famous Descartes. It's called Descartes' demon. Imagine you're not really connected to reality, but actually a demon feeds all the sense information to you, and it just looks like you're in the world, but actually it's a demon just tricking you. Another concept is this concept of materialism, which is that the only things that exist are bodies and their properties. So that's why you see in that picture that they're material parts moving, like just matter. We're just a human being under materialism is just a ball of flesh flying through space. So in particular, it means that there are no immaterial aspects to reality. So there are no things like angels, thinking has no immaterial aspects, and so on. Another concept is the one of nominalism. Nominalism says that the only things that exist are individuals. There are no natures or essences or universals. So everything you see is just seems to be similar to something else. So if you look at that picture with dogs, there's no such thing as a dog. There are just things which look similar. There's no concept of dogness. There is no nature of dog. So dog is merely a name we apply to particular things that happen to look alike. So that's why you have this name. Nominalism comes from the Latin nomen, which means name. So this nominalism rejects that there is such a thing as a dog or a human or any other things that we define through their natures. Lastly, we have relativism. So we already heard what Justice Kennedy said about man being his own measure of things, but this was already said thousands of years ago. Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and what is not that it is not. So true means true for me, or what appears true to me. Good means good for me, what I claim to be good for me, or good for a certain group. So what a group claims to be good for them. There in the picture, you see two people looking at the same object, a tree, and one sees a dead tree and one sees a living tree, right? So the relativism entails that there is no real truth. We all come up with our own truth, and it's just, I mean, in a way, it's an illusion. There is no true thing. Whatever we believe is true for me, but might not be true for someone else. And of course, I mean, this would also destroy things like mathematics, because people then start rejecting that there are things like mathematical truths which are true for everyone. They might not be true for everyone. Maybe they're just true here, because maybe someone else will say that they're not true. Okay, now, about you, but I don't feel comfortable accepting any of these things. Just if you look, I mean, your own intuition should tell you that these things lead to absurdities. So that's why Lloyd Gerson, who's a philosopher at the University of Toronto, came up with this term Ur-Platonism. Right? He said that in order to do philosophy, real philosophy, you need to reject these things. So this means you need to think that anti-materialism is true. So materialism is false. Anti-nominalism, anti-skepticism, and anti-relativism. But this is just what our own intuition tells us, right? So Ur-Platonism just coheres with what our intuition and common sense tell us about the world. Namely, we are in touch with reality. We can know the truth. Things have nature, so there exist cats, dogs, humans, plants. They're not just similar things which we name by the same concept. Truth is objective. It's not just something we make up. So if you follow this umbrella term of Ur-Platonism, it leads to a very unified philosophical system which can explain reality, can explain change, unity, the fact that the mind is not material. There are immaterial aspects of the mind, and many other problems which are unsolvable otherwise. So if you follow Ur-Platonism, you kind of get a coherent view of reality, which also agrees with your common sense. So that's a bonus. So under this broad umbrella of Ur-Platonism, it's possible to prove that God exists just using reason. And we already saw, so Plato already believed in one God. And he said that the end of life is to be like God, and the soul following God will be like him. We also saw what Aristotle said, that God is the divine intellect, or the nous, the unmoved mover, that stands as final cause responsible for the intelligible motion of the cosmos. And Plotinus, in a way, that even though he had something like a trinity, for him the ultimate reality was the one, called it the one. And the one is the cause of both being and of thought for him, just as the enabling condition of their togetherness. And then he says, and just as this condition is beyond both thought and being. So for him, he proved or came up with the proof that God exists. For him, God was the one. And God was so transcendent that he was not even a being. He was beyond being. Then if we go to St. Thomas Aquinas, he has an interesting proof of the existence of God. I'll just very briefly sketch because it's complicated. But basically, he looks at these two concepts of essence and existence. So for essence is the answer of the question, what is it? So if you want to ask what is the essence of a cat, you're basically answering the question, what is it to be a cat? What is it to be human? Well, human means to be a rational animal. That's the essence of humanity or the nature. The word existence, on the other hand, just denotes a thing that exists. So that is a being, right? It's something which is the subject of, has, or participates in existence. So these are concepts which you cannot define like in mathematics because they're kind of the building blocks of everything. So you cannot define existence with something which is even more fundamental than existence itself. What does Aquinas say? He says that if you look at a thing, you can look at its essence and its existence, right? But he claims that the essence of a thing, any created thing, any finite thing, should not be the same as its existence. So there should be a difference between the existence of a thing and what that thing is. So to say that what a thing is distinct from its act of existing. What a thing is does not include or explain that it is. And there you have the picture of a phoenix, right? You can imagine what a phoenix is. But we know that phoenix, they don't exist, right? So just knowing what something is or knowing the essence of something doesn't tell you that it exists. So he's able to prove that in finite beings, essence and existence must be distinct. And then he argues that in order for any finite thing to exist, there has to be a unique, infinite being in which the opposite happens. There's no more distinction between essence and existence. There's this one being, which we call God, in which essence and existence coincide. So what that means is the essence of God, the nature of God, is existence itself. So then any finite being in which essence and existence are really distinct will be created by God. So not only does he prove this way that God exists, but he also proves that God is one. There cannot be more than one God. You can argue from this, you can get all kinds of divine properties. So, for example, he argues that whatever is in the effect has to exist in some sense in the cause. So if you look at humans, we're all created by God, and we know we are personal, right? Humans are personal. So that means that God, who's the cause, has to have that in himself too. Like he has to be personal as well. A rock would not be able to create something personal. So there's this axiom which says that, well, the cause cannot create more than it has, right? So it cannot create an effect that's not already in the cause somehow. So we see that God is personal. Then you can argue that God is existence, that he maintains everything in existence at every moment. So God is not a deist God which creates something and then is far away. No, God has to keep us in existence every second. He continuously keeps us in existence. And then he knows, wills, and guides all things. So God's providence is everywhere. But nothing we cannot do anything without God. As we hear in Exodus, so this concept of the divine simplicity is already in the Bible, in the Old Testament, when God says, I am the one who is, or the one who is sent me. He already shows his absolute transcendence and the fact that in him there is no difference between essence and existence. He is existence itself. This is kind of where we can get to through philosophy. Philosophy gets us to the existence, the uniqueness, the fact that God is utterly transcendent, that he's all-powerful, creates the creator of all finite things, keeps us all in existence, keeps the whole universe in existence. But how do we get from this God of the philosophers to the God of the Bible, right? Because there's still quite a difference. And course, we need divine revelation, as God's mysteries still beyond finite human reason. We can get up to some point, but no matter how far we can go on our own, the gap is still infinite. And God has to come and reveal himself to us. And then we go again to what St. Paul said, where he was trying to convince the Greek philosophers that the God they had already found through philosophy, the God of the philosophers, is exactly the God of the Christian God, the God of the Old Testament and of the New Testament. So I just say a part of it. For as I passed along, says St. Paul, and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything. So there is no difference between the God of the philosophers and the Christian God. Oh, there is a difference in that we know much more about God's interior life because he came and revealed himself to us. Okay, but now the question is, how do we find the true religion? So how do we get from just knowing that God exists? How do we get to Christianity and Catholicism in particular? So philosophy can show us that God exists, and is not only does he exist, but he is good. He is the good, right? So we can expect, it's fitting that God wants to be known to his creatures. If he is good, it doesn't make sense for him to want to hide himself from us, right? So then we can look for so-called motives of credibility. And there are 4. We can look at miracles, we can look at prophecies, we can look at the church, and then we can look at the beauty of Christ and the saints, right? And so I'll use some of the lectures of theologian Lawrence Feingold, but if you want to go really in depth, you can go read Garrigou Lagrange's 2-volume work on divine revelation, which was translated by Professor Meinard from the Byzantine Catholic Seminary. Okay, so let's look at the first motive of credibility. Well, there are many miracles. There are Old Testament miracles, right? You have Moses performing miracles, Elijah, Elisha. Then in the New Testament, you have Christ's miracles, the resurrection, Pentecost. But then you also have more modern miracles like Fatima. Right? The miracle of the sun at Fatima was witnessed by thousands of people, many of them atheists, and it's a true witness to Catholicism, right? Where our Blessed Mother appeared. I mean, you cannot really have a miracle that's witnessed by more people than that. Then you have Lourdes and so on, and many others. So these miracles are pointing us in the direction. They're showing us how God revealed himself, how he's telling us which is the true faith. Then you can look at prophecies. Lawrence Feingold says hundreds of prophecies of the Messiah can be found in the Old Testament, spanning 2,000 years. Thus, the greatest motive of credibility for the Old Testament is its prophecies of Christ. And the great motive of credibility in Christ is that his coming was foretold in so many marvelous ways. Again, we see that the Old and New Testament witness forms an indestructible harmony such that each reinforces the other. So you see this powerful connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because there are all these prophecies or these adumbrations, prefigurements of what would come next, and all of them were accomplished in Christ, right? Well, through the incarnation of our Lord. Then we can look at the church, right? The church itself, as Vatican I says, but even the church itself, by itself, because of its marvelous propagation, its exceptional holiness, and inexhaustible fruitfulness in all good works, because of its Catholic unity and invincible stability, is a very great and perpetual motive of credibility, and an incontestable witness of its own divine mission. So the fact that the church itself persevered for 2,000 plus years, that itself is a miracle. because nothing created by human hands has lasted that long. Right? So the witness of the church. And that's what St. Augustine says, right? That the success of the church is a witness. He says, and now we have three incredible things, all of which have come to pass. It is incredible that Jesus Christ should have risen in the flesh and ascended with flesh into heaven. It is incredible that the world should have believed so incredible a thing. It is incredible that a very few men of mean birth and the lowest rank and no education should have been able so effectually to persuade the world, and even its learned men, of so incredible a thing. So really, if you think about it, I mean, that itself should point towards the authenticity of our faith. Then we can look at the beauty of Christ and the saints, right? Who is not touched when he reads the Gospels and about Christ, right? But then we also have the saints, because sometimes maybe it's hard to identify with a carpenter from 2,000 years ago, but that's why we have saints, and we can look at their lives and how Christ is talking through their lives, right? Pope Benedict the 16th said, I have often affirmed my conviction that the true apology of Christian faith, the most convincing demonstration of its truth against every denial, are the saints and the beauty that the faith has generated. Today, for faith to grow, we must lead ourselves and the persons we meet to encounter the saints and to enter into contact with the beautiful. So the lives of the saints, just by reading their lives, many people are converted because God speaks to them through these saints. When you see the early fathers and when you see them dying for the faith, I mean, you cannot but be touched, and you see that they truly believed it, and they couldn't have done it on their own. Like, that perseverance was because God was with them. So the saints and the as Pope Benedict XVI says, the contact with the beautiful. Beauty really converts people. It touches them, right? When they go into a church and they see the icons and they see all this beauty and how beautiful the divine liturgy is, many are touched, and God does change their hearts. Okay, so we get to faith now. So we saw that reason can lead us up to a certain point. Then God also left us these motives of credibility. But then, in order to truly be in communion with God, we need faith, right? And we know that faith is not believing something without evidence or verification. It's not a subjective feeling about something such as God, but faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen, right? So faith just means trusting God when he reveals something to us. Just like when, imagine that your mother tells you that she loves you. You don't need proof of that. You already, I mean, because she is your mother, you already trust her. So that's a type of natural faith. But so much more would you trust God because he is the absolute and transcendent God, your creator. Of course, you will trust him. Or he gives you, like, faith is also a gift, right? He gives you this gift and you have to accept it. Okay, now we can ask again, what happens if we reject God, right? So if we don't believe in God, then the only option is atheism, right? And then that leads to naturalism or materialism. So naturalism means that only natural things exist, nothing supernatural. And materialism, again, means there are only material things. There's nothing immaterial. So only bodies and forces exist, basically. We're just atoms flying through space. Nietzsche famously said that God is dead. And then we also had it on the cover of Time in the 60s. The question was posed that, is God dead? Okay, so if you think God is dead, one option is scientism. Scientism is what is fashionable again among scientists and many intellectuals. So it's the view that all real knowledge is scientific knowledge that comes from applying the scientific method. So there's nothing that doesn't come from the scientific method. That's why you see there on the right the scientist worshiping the scientific method. However, this view is incoherent. It's first of all, in order to do science, you must presuppose that there exists an objective world external to the minds of scientists. Second, science must assume that the world is governed by regular laws which can be explored by humans. Third, science must assume that the human mind can comprehend the world. And then finally, four, there are things which cannot be described through mathematics, since they are qualitative and not quantitative. So mathematics and science, meaning, because there's no science without mathematics, can only deal with quantitative things. But if you look at morality and other things, they're not quantifiable through equations. So not everything can be reduced to equations. Right? So that's why science can only deal with things which can be reduced to equations, but it's not true that everything can. So it doesn't prove that. Science is just incoherent from the start. Now, St. Paul already warned us that the more we know and the more intelligent we are, this can lead to pride. It can puff us up with pride. And it can happen to not just scientists, but also theologians and philosophers. And you see that quite often. In 1 Corinthians, we hear, "Now in regard to meat sacrificed to idols, we realize that all of us have knowledge. Knowledge inflates with pride, but love builds up. If anyone supposes he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know." So St. Paul was already warning that we can easily be inflated. And think of the Pharisee who was thinking that he was so righteous and so humble, and yet he was full of pride. Right? So it's very easy to fall into this trap. After all, the devil also fell into this trap, right? And he's far beyond our intellectual powers. Now, Carl Jung, who's not necessarily seen as a friend of Christianity, also had something to say about scientists. He said, "Science is certainly not a perfect instrument, but it is excellent and invaluable. It does no harm unless it makes itself out to be an end in itself. Science is meant to serve. When it lays claim to power, it is on the wrong track. It is even meant to serve the other sciences, for each of them, being insufficient in itself, needs all the others. So science contributes to our understanding. It dims our comprehension only when it considers its message to us to be an absolute." So what Jung is saying is science is very useful. We should not reject science. We can learn a lot through science, but once we worship at the altar of science, we worship a false idol, and it actually brings destruction. Now, there's this view that many atheists and many scientists make, is that there's this amazing unity of science. So the claim is that materialistic philosophy led to the inexorable advance of science, right? We look at how much technology and science has progressed, and we're tempted to say that, well, that shows that scientism is true. So their claim is that science can explain everything, and the progress of science has led us closer to the unity of science. Now, the question is whether this is true, like if science tends to get more and more unified or not. And I'll use the work of a Catholic philosopher from UT Austin, Rob Koons, to look into this question. So this is what Koons says. "If we look simply at very recent history, we find that the confident prediction in the 1950s of unity of science enthusiasts has not been borne out. We have not found ways to derive the laws of biology, psychology, and other so-called special sciences from the master science of fundamental physics. In fact, new discoveries have made any hope that we might do so seem ever more far-fetched. Information and other non-physical entities play an ever larger role in biology. cognitive psychology and linguistics. Even doctrinaire materialists within philosophy have largely abandoned any claim that mental properties and events can be reduced to physiology and physics, with other forms of non-reductive materialism becoming the predominant fashion. So it seems that this unity of science is a dream that we're getting farther and farther away from. So the progress of science shows more and more that the different sciences are actually becoming more and more separated rather than unified, right? Because the dream was always that you just have one theory of everything. You have physics, and physics explains biology, it explains everything. You don't need any of the other sciences. Now, if you look at something like quantum mechanics, which is very abstract, but this already shows that these ideas of materialism are completely false. So here's what Kuhn says. Modern quantum mechanics displays the marks of both aspects of the Platonic heritage: the primacy of exact mathematical formulas and the rejection of the necessity for mechanistic explanation. This latter aspect of quantum theory is most evident in its embrace of causal non-locality, instantaneous action at a distance, a consequence of Bell's theorem. So the distance between the atomism of Democritus and Epicurus and the mathematically rigorous, holistically intertwined world of modern quantum theory could not be greater. So again, seems complicated, but what he says is that if you look at quantum mechanics, this shows, like a good interpretation of quantum mechanics shows that it's not possible to just build everything from the bottom up. It's not true that we just take atoms and put them together and they create like substances and so on. Actually, you need a top-down approach too. So you cannot, quantum mechanics shows that you cannot reduce everything to just these particles flying around in space. There needs to be something which goes from the top down. Now, scientism also leads, Kuhn says, to a universe with no explanation. He says the atheist has no explanation for the unity of the physical universe, why the stories of the various participants in the world must cohere into a single, consistent world history. The atheist has no explanation for the amazing consistency across space and time of the relatively small number of natural kinds we observe. What makes one electron, photon, or quark so much like another at one time when there is such a vast number of them, and what makes each so stable over long stretches of time? In other words, why do we have a finite number, like a small number of these elementary particles? Why don't we have tens of millions of them, all being different, and just utter chaos? Like, why do the laws of physics themselves have to be nice and symmetric so that we can measure them? Why could they just not be so complicated that you can never measure anything? So why is there order rather than chaos, and so on? The atheist has no explanation for this. It's a miracle for them, right? So it seems that science actually depends on theism, and that the birth of science itself was based on the belief that God exists, and specifically the Christian God. So there are fundamental elements of Western theism, each of which provided a necessary condition for the engendering of modern science. So there would have been no science without Christianity. This is the argument. So first of all, if you look at laws of nature, the belief in the intelligibility and mathematical exactitude of the universe as the artifact of a perfect mind working with suitable material that it has created ex nihilo, out of nothing, and the closely connected Hebraic conception of God as a lawgiver. Right? The idea of a law of nature, it's very interesting, was first explicitly formulated by our father, St. Basil the Great, where he applied the biblical model of God as lawgiver to the Greek picture of an ordered cosmos. Right? So if the Christian God exists, and also the God of the Old Testament, we expect laws of nature because we know that God is the lawgiver. Right? So we expect symmetry, we expect beauty in the universe, and we expect things to be, again, unified in a sense and intelligible. Another fact is that because as Christians, we believe that we are images of God, there's this belief in the fitness of the human mind, right? Created in the image of God to the task of scientific investigation, conceived as a vocation given by God. Right? So if we're created in God's image, we have an intellect, we're expected, since God is the creator of everything else, that God also gave us the possibility to explore the universe. Right? In Genesis, we hear God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So Christians, because they knew they were created in the image of God, had this impetus to explore the universe, because they believed that they had this capacity. Whereas others, like the ancient Greeks, did not necessarily believe that they had the capacity to understand the world. That's why they were kind of more interested in the abstract side than into exploring the natural world through science. Now, there's also the concept of God's omnipotence, right? So the need for observation, Kuhn says, and experiment to discover how in fact God has exercised his sovereign freedom and absolute omnipotence in crafting and legislating for the creation. So we know that God is all-powerful and that he created the universe, but he was not forced to create it in a certain way. There are many different ways in which he could have created the universe. So we have to look out there in the universe and see what God created and how, right? So we, as Christians, know that God has a free will. So he was not forced to create. Like the Greeks sometimes believe that creation is like an emanation from God. He was forced. It was necessary for God to create, and he couldn't have created anything else. But we know that that's not the case. Christians don't believe that. So that's why they were interested in knowing how God created and what he created. And this actually led to the Copernican and Galilean revolutions. Now, the parallel between the book of God, the book of Scripture, the Bible, and the book of nature, right? So Christians also had this conception of nature as a divine book, parallel to the Bible. The two-book model was a favorite theme of Galileo, Kepler, Bacon, and others. You see many of these famous scientists. So historians have discovered fruitful interaction between scientific theorizing and the development of biblical hermeneutics in the late Middle Ages, Renaissance, Reformation, and Counter-Reformation. For example, Michael Faraday said that the book of nature, which we have to read, is written by the finger of God. And St. Ephrem the Syrian said that God reveals his truth in two books, the book of nature and the book of scriptures. Again, you see why Christians expected to be able to find laws of nature, because they were paralleling the laws from the Bible, and they saw that nature itself was a book. There was a book written for it, and you could explore or read that book. Another thing was that Christianity destroyed animism and polytheism, right? So Kuhn says that disenchantment of the world by theism, clearing away the potentially discordant divinities and semi-divinities of polytheism and animism. Right? Polytheism, we were seeing God, there are many gods, and then animism, you see gods everywhere. Like you see that, like the sun is a god, the planets are gods, the grass is a god, like some kind of divinity. So if you believe that, there was no reason to look for laws of nature, because you just have these gods and they do whatever they want, right? So, and also, like the Greeks believed that the sun and the moon and the planets were divine. Well, they were not trying to find laws, because they were just divinities. So just taking away like this idea that things are all divine led to the possibility of science and Newton's unification of the explanation of motion, right? Because Newton started to look into, well, what are the laws that govern how two bodies interact? Another thing is the linear view of time. The ancients believed that things are just recurring. It's just a permanent cycle. So the linear view of time, right, beginning with creation and passing through the unique, unrepeatable events of the Divine Comedy, in place of the otherwise ubiquitous conception of a cyclical great year. This enabled Christian theists to conceive of the possibility of unprecedented progress in scientific knowledge and technical efficacy, in contrast to the endemic resignation and pessimism of antiquity. So basically, if you believe that things are just cyclical and they always, no matter how much progress there is, it's it's going to turn into dust, and then again there's progress and turns into dust. Well, it doesn't make much sense to start looking for the truth if you know that it's not going anywhere, right? That's why you see in that picture the serpent in Viking mythology eating its own tail, right? So you don't go anywhere because it's just a cyclical, perpetual, nihilistic view, basically. Another thing was that now after the incarnation, we can see matter as being good, right? So Kuhn says the elevation of the dignity of matter and of manual work as a consequence of the theological doctrine of the incarnation, especially given Jesus' occupation as a carpenter. Modern science was possible only when investigators became willing to dirty their hands in workshops and laboratories, and only when they began to see all material things which have been created by God as good in themselves. So remember the Gnostics, remember the Manichaeans, who believed that matter was bad? Well, we know that matter is good because God created it, and also because Christ, the second person of the Trinity, became incarnate, right? So we know matter is good. And then, as Kuhn says, also the fact that Christ was a carpenter shows that it's not beyond someone to get their hands dirty, right? So matter is good, and we can explore the universe by actually doing experiments. Whereas the Greeks or other civilizations were not so interested in experiments. They believe that matter is, in a way, entrapping our soul, and we want to get rid of matter so that we really get to the truth as just immaterial beings. Okay, so what this argument showed was that science, there would have been no science without theism, right? Because Christians believed in the Christian God, this led to science, led to the possibility of science, right? But maybe this was just an illusion. So now we have science. We needed Christianity for science, but now maybe we can get rid of Christianity, right? Maybe we don't need it anymore, right? Now that science did develop, maybe we can just look at science and reject theism. So now we'll look at that reason and knowledge actually. So reason, science, and knowledge in general are impossible under materialism, naturalism, or atheism. So not only would have science not developed, but not even reason itself, we would not be able to trust our own reason, which is much more than doing science. Of course, then you cannot do science if atheism and materialism are true. So here I'll use some arguments that Joe Heschmeyer, the Catholic apologist, well, he has a video about it. I recommend it, called Prove God's Existence with Science. First, we have to look into what do we need in order to do science. And there are two axioms which have to be satisfied, or you cannot even get started without those things being satisfied. So first, the universe must be knowable. If the universe is not knowable, well, you can never do science. And then two, our minds have to be capable of capturing or knowing true things. So we have to be able to know truth. So our minds, if we look from a materialistic evolutionary perspective, so blind evolution, we have to be able to show that our minds have evolved so that they can capture truth. So now the question is whether materialism and blind evolution can yield knowledge. So we'll focus on the second part here, right? So whether our minds are capable of capturing or knowing true things. So let's look at now what evolution means. Again, this is blind evolution. There's also a theistic version of evolution. But if we look at blind evolution, according to evolution, individuals with traits that enable them to adapt to their environments will help them survive and have more offspring, which will inherit those traits. Individuals with less adaptive traits will less frequently survive to pass them on. Over time, the traits that enable species to survive and reproduce will become more frequent in the population, and the population will change or evolve. The theory is sometimes described as survival of the fittest. So fitness refers to an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. So if you look at blind evolution, what makes someone fit is whether it allows them to survive or not. And now let's see what John Gray, who's an atheist philosopher at London School of Economics, says. So he believes in materialism and evolution. So he says, if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, then knowing the truth is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. To think otherwise is to resurrect the pre-Darwinian error that humans are different from all other animals. And now we'll go a bit more in depth, see why it's the case that under blind evolution, it's just not possible to know the truth. So Darwinian theory tells us that an interest in truth is not needed for survival or reproduction. More often, it is a disadvantage. And if we look in nature, deception is a common among primates and birds. As Heinrich, a biologist, observes, ravens pretend to hide a cache of food while secreting it somewhere else. So evolutionary psychologists have shown that deceit is pervasive in animal communication. So lying is good. But now, here comes the fun part. Not only lying, but self-lying is good. So among humans, the best deceivers are those who deceive themselves. We deceive ourselves in order to deceive others better, says Wright, a famous evolutionary biologist. A lover who promises eternal fidelity is more likely to be believed if he believes his promise himself. He is no more likely to keep the promise, though. So in a competition for mates, a well-developed capacity for self-deception is an advantage. So the same is true in politics and many other contexts. So the claim is that it is, from an evolutionary perspective, sometimes not only does truth not matter, but it's good to lie to yourself. So here the example is you have to lie to yourself so well that you also believe it, right? So self-deception. Gray says, truth has no systematic evolutionary advantage over error. Quite to the contrary, evolution will select for degrees of self-deception, rendering some facts and motives unconscious so as not to betray, by subtle signs of self-knowledge, the deception being practiced. As Trivers, another famous evolutionary biologist, points out, evolution favors useful error. The conventional view that natural selection favors nervous systems which produce ever more accurate images of the world must be a very naive view of mental evolution. So this argument shows that if you believe in materialism, naturalism, and blind evolution, there's no reason to believe that you can trust your reason. Your reason might be telling you all kinds of things, but it doesn't have to track the truth. For example, imagine that thousands of years ago, someone would come across a tiger, and they would believe that the tiger is a very nice and fluffy creature. But when you see a nice and fluffy creature, what you should do is run away. Well, evolutionarily, it doesn't matter that it was wrong what that person believed, because he ran away and he didn't get eaten by the tiger. But so evolution does not need to track truth. Blind evolution, again. So I'm not claiming that no type of evolution is compatible with theism. So it seems that science, and not only science, but reason itself is impossible under naturalism, materialism, and evolution. So not only can you not do science, but your own reason, you cannot trust your own reason because you can lie to yourself. There's self-deception, which is sometimes good, and so on. So let's go back. So we said in order to do science, and more generally in order to trust our reason, we need the universe to be knowable, and then we need our minds to be capable of capturing or knowing true things. And now the evolutionary argument we've just seen, which is what many evolutionary biologists themselves say, right? They don't realize that when they say that you cannot reach the truth, that's a kind of a self-destructive argument, because they're telling us something they say is true, but then they also say that you cannot know the truth. So it's a bit funny. But so two is false. Our minds cannot, under naturalism and evolution, our minds cannot capture true things. We don't know if they're true or not. They might sometimes, 50% of the time they're true, 50% you don't know what's true and what's not. So, and also there's no reason for the universe itself to be knowable. Why should it be knowable? The universe just came out of nothing. There's no reason. There just exists. There's no reason that it should be knowable. However, if God exists, both of those premises, it's very likely they're true, right? Because if God exists, we have a good reason to believe the world is knowable, because it was created by God, who's perfect, and he creates things which like are knowable to us because he created us in his image, right? And then two as well, if God exists, we have a good reason to believe our minds are capable of knowing the truth, because again, we're created in his image. It doesn't make sense for God to create us in such a way that we're just lying to ourselves and we can never know the truth. So there are good reasons to believe that science and reason are possible if God exists, whereas there are no good reasons, or even you can show that it's not possible at all if science and reason are just not possible if God does not exist. Okay, so now, towards the end, I want to look at what else atheism implies. So I'll look at some famous atheists and see where their atheism led them. Now, these will not be direct arguments against naturalism, but they will just show you how you can get to very counterintuitive and sometimes more than absurd views if you start from naturalism. First, I will go to a physicist, Lawrence Krauss. He says that he will give a complete explanation in purely scientific terms of why anything exists rather than nothing. Okay? So first he says there's energy present in empty space together with the laws of physics. And so energy plus the laws of physics might have given rise to the universe as it exists today. But then he realizes later in the book, says that, well, energy plus the laws of physics, that's not really nothing, right? So he wants to explain how the universe comes out of nothing, but then he says that, well, the laws of physics plus energy, that's not really quite nothing. So then finally, his final proposal is, there may be no fundamental theory at all, but just layer upon layer of laws of physics ad infinitum. That's why you see in that picture. So there's this picture. It's like, what holds the earth, right? I think it's the ancients were wondering how the earth stands without falling, right? So first, there's a first turtle, which the earth is like it rests on that turtle, and then you ask, well, what happens to that turtle? Why doesn't the turtle fall? Well, there's another turtle. And you keep going, right? So there's nothing explaining anything, because every time you say, there are these laws which explain the universe. Well, how are these laws explained? By these other laws. And then by these other laws. You just go forever and there's no explanation, actually, which is absurd, of course. So Krauss, who's a famous physicist, didn't quite prove how the universe came out of nothing. Now, Daniel Dennett, he passed away recently. He's considered one of the most famous recent philosophers of mind. He said the following things. He says that consciousness does not exist and is merely an illusion. We don't have thoughts. There's no consciousness. Another thing he said is that the universe creates itself ex nihilo. So The universe created itself out of nothing, right? The absurdity is like mind-boggling, right? Or at any rate, out of something that is well nigh indistinguishable from nothing at all. So maybe not nothing, but something very small that's basically nothing. Okay, let's now go to Francis Crick, right? He got the Nobel Prize. He got the Nobel Prize in medicine, and he says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Who you are is nothing but a pack of neurons. So really, again, we're just it's a slightly more technical version. You're a ball of flesh flying through space. There's nothing, but you don't exist really. You don't have thoughts. There's nothing. You're just a bunch of atoms put together. Alex Rosenberg, we heard from him in the beginning of the lecture. He says there's no enduring self. The existence of the self is an illusion, right? So there's no self. And things are becoming more and more interesting. Now, Peter Singer, he's a philosopher and a professor at Princeton, and he's a moral philosopher. So this is what he says. Human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons. Therefore, the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. And then he also defends infanticide, right? Because he says that a 2-year-old is not a person. He says infanticide up to age 2, when humans become self-conscious, should be allowed. Now, this is pretty monstrous. He also defends euthanasia, and people asked him about his own mother, like if you cannot support the society, what you should do, and it's hard to believe that someone thinks that you should euthanize people when they're not useful, and also that a 2-year-old is less valuable than a pig or a dog. Now, David Benatar goes even further. It just gets worse. David Benatar, a South African philosopher, says that each one of us was harmed by being brought into existence. The harm is not negligible, because the quality of even the best lives is very bad, and considerably worse than most people recognize it to be. Although it is obviously too late to prevent our own existence, it is not too late to prevent the existence of future possible people. So David Benatar says that it's better never to have been, because there's so much suffering, and then in the end, if you're an atheist, everything dies. There's the heat death of the universe, and nothing matters. So why should we suffer? It's pointless. So he says that nobody should have existed. Now, finally, I look at Thomas Nagel, and Thomas Nagel is interesting. It's interesting because Thomas Nagel is very famous, and he actually has many arguments against materialism, but he's still an atheist. So this is what he says. I'm talking about something much deeper, namely the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheists to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. So it's interesting because, like I said, Thomas Nagel did a lot of work in the philosophy of mind and showed that it's impossible for the mind to just be a material thing. Yet he has this fear of God, and he does not want God to exist. Right? So you don't want to be subject to anything. It's exactly that pride, that fear of not being your own God. So the question is, how can we get to these views? Pope John Paul II tells us that if human beings with their intelligence fail to recognize God as creator of all, it is not because they lack the means to do so. but because their free will and their sinfulness place an impediment in the way. So it is not that we cannot get there. We can prove through reason that God exists. We have divine revelation. We have the motives of credibility. We have God's grace working in us, but we have to turn away from that, right? So I was an atheist for a long part of my life, so I know exactly what it's like to be an atheist. How none of the arguments for the existence of God, they didn't move me at all. They were just, and many of my friends also are completely unmoved by these arguments. So what's the conclusion? So if we just use classical philosophy and reason, we can prove the existence of God. But we've seen that reason cannot take us all the way to the interior life of God, right? The Trinity, the Incarnation, and so on. For this, we need divine revelation. St. Augustine says, God does not expect us to submit our faith to him without reason, but the very limits of our reason make faith a necessity, right? So faith is necessary so that we get closer to God, but God doesn't want us to just be irrational and believe irrational things, right? So faith is the perfection of reason. And then we looked at the motives of credibility, like miracles, prophecies, the life of Christ, the saints. Those show us that Catholicism is true. Right? Then we switched tacks and we looked at science and reason, and we've seen that science and reason are not possible without theism, and that scientism and naturalism lead to absurd conclusions about nature, human consciousness, and morality. So faith and reason are not in conflict. Right? St. John Paul II said that faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And Pope Benedict XVI said, far from being in conflict, faith, reason, and science go hand in hand in the service of man's enhancement and his wide stewardship of creation. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory to Christ.